We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Vav Amud Aleph in Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 56a. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought a brisa which is discussing the soyer of the nasi. That's if the king sins, he brings a soyer, a he-goat. It's a carbon chatas, and the brisa is saying that it has to be slaughtered in the north of the Azara. And the brisa says that that's true really of all carbon chatos. They're all slaughtered in the north of the Azara. And so therefore the Gemara has a question, why is it that there's a pasuk v'shachat oso, that the soyer of the nasi should be slaughtered in the north of the Azara? That seems to be excluding some other carbon that is not slaughtered in the north of the Azara. What is it coming to exclude? That was the question of the Gemara in the previous summit. And the Gemara suggested on the previous summit that it's coming to exclude the soyer of Nachshon, that refers to the he-goat brought by Nachshon ben Aminadav, by the Chanukas HaMizbeach, by the inauguration of the Mishkan. All of the Nesiim, they brought these karbonos again, and by the Chanukas HaNesiim, by the soyer, the goat that's brought by each Nasi, that does not require the north of the Mizbeach. And the Gemara asked on the previous summit, why would one think that it requires the north of the Mizbeach? And the Gemara said, since we find that the soyer Nachshon does require smicha, therefore one might also think it requires the north of the Mizbeach, and that's why Oso is excluding and saying again the soyer of Nachshon does not require the north of the Mizbeach. The Gemara then asked, where do we see that smicha, leaning upon the animal, is required by the soyer of Nachshon? And the Gemara said to that it says by the soyer of the Nasi v'samach, it says that he's going to lean, and it says al rosh ha-soyer. It doesn't need to say the word soyer, it doesn't need to say the word he-goat, and that comes to include, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the soyer of Nachshon. And therefore we see, according to Rabbi Yehuda, again the soyer of Nachshon requires smicha. And the Bryce here continues that Rabbi Shimon says it does not come to include the soyer of Nachshon, but rather l'rabo si'irei avodas kochavim l'smicha. It comes to include the he-goat that is brought for the sin of avodah zara, that requires smicha, that requires leaning upon the animal. And so the Gemara now continues, Maskif lo Ravina. Ravina asks, therefore, Teinach lo Rabbi Yehuda. So this answer is good according to Rabbi Yehuda, because again, the entire answer on the previous summit was, since smicha is required by the soyer of Nachshon, one might think that Safo in the north of the Mizbeach is also, the north of the Azar is also required, and so therefore again, that's why we need the exclusion. So that works according to Rabbi Yehuda, that smicha is in fact required for the soyer of Nachshon. But Rabbi Shimon, but according to Rabbi Shimon, what are we going to say? Rashi explains, Teinach lo Rabbi Yehuda demarbi leila smicha. Again, Rabbi Yehuda includes smicha by the soyer of Nachshon. So itzrich lemutei mitzafon. So therefore, it's necessary to exclude it from the requirement of north. But according to Rabbi Shimon, what are we going to say? And the Gemara continues, Amrle Marzutra breder Rav Mori lo Ravina. Marzutra, the son of Rav Mori, said to Ravina, lo Rabbi Yehuda nami. But according to Rabbi Yehuda also, maidis Rabbi is Rabbi. What does smicha have to do with this? Whatever is included is included. Okay, so we include smicha. But maida lois Rabbi. But what is not included, like the requirement of north, is not included. Why do we need a specific exclusion, even according to Rabbi Yehuda? And the Gemara continues, V'chitema, if you're going to say, ilo miate kro, if not for the fact that the pasuk excluded it, so then havamina, then one might have thought, teisi bevinyanav, that we should learn it from a binyanav, just like we find over here, so too we find here as well, just like we find in general that north is required, so too we would say by the soyer of Nachshon, we would say that is required, that north is required. But if you're going to say there's a binyanav, if you're going to say that the soyer of Nachshon can just be learned out from the general requirement by the carbon chatos, so smicha gufa, so then smicha itself, lishtok kramine, the pasuk could be silent, it doesn't need to include the soyer of Nachshon, v'teisi bevinyanav, it could just be learned through a binyanav, we'll just learn just like we find by chatos, so too over here by the soyer of Nachshon. So ella, rather, you have to say, sham midoros lo yalfinan, we can't learn a carbon that was just for that time period. The soyer of Nachshon was only at that time in the Midbar. You can't learn that from something that's all generations. And so hachanami shah midoros lo yalfinan. So too over here, you wouldn't learn shah from doros. And so therefore, again, we still don't really need an exclusion. As long as it wasn't included, that should be enough. And then we're back to the question, what is oso coming to exclude? And Rashi explains, v'chitema lo meate meoso. If we're not going to exclude it from oso, asi mi binyanav, maybe you'll say it's learned from a binyanav, kishar chatos, that it's just like other chatos, shatun and safon, just like they require north, so too this requires north. Halo matzah amrit, you can't say that. The imkain de v'chlal chatos, if you're going to say it's just part of all the regular category of chatos, amai marbi leila smicha, then you wouldn't need the inclusion for smicha. Lishto krame al rosh hasor de smicha, the pasuk could be silent, you don't need the phrase al rosh hasor by smicha. V'teise smichas nachshon mi binyanav, and you learn smichas nachshon from a binyanav. The mamatzino b'shar chatos, the liton smicha, afzeh kain, just like by other chatos, smicha is required, so too here. And so Rashi continues, Ella, you have to say, Shami Doros lo Yalfinan, we don't learn Shami Doros. Hilkach hamay yitzrich lemute mitzafon. So therefore, again, why do we need Oso to exclude the Sar of Nachshon from the requirement of Tzafon? And so the Gemara instead continues, Ella, rather Oso, what do we learn from the word Oso? Again, by the Sar of the Nasi, we say Oso, the Sar of the Nasi, To and Safon, if that needs to be in the north, V'ein hashochet omid b'tzafon. We mean to say that the animal needs to be in the north, but the one doing the slaughtering, the shochet, he does not need to stand in the north. And Rashi explains, Oso hakarban b'tzafon. It simply means the carbon, the animal, is in the north. Aval hashochet yachol lamod b'daram. But the one doing the slaughtering can stand in the south. V'shochet b'saken aruch. And then he can slaughter with a long knife. That's what we learn from the word Oso in the pasuk. But the Gemara asks on that, mid Rabbi Achia nafka. That we also know. We know that from Rabbi Achia already. The Tanya, as we learned in a Braisa, Rabbi Achia says, V'shachat Oso al yerech hamizbeach tzafon. He slaughters it on the north side of the Mizbeach. Matamad Lomer, why does the pasuk say this? Lefisha motzinu b'mekabel, because we find by the one receiving the blood, she'omed b'tzafon and mekabel b'tzafon, that he stands in the north and he receives the blood in the north. V'im amad b'dorim v'kibel b'tzafon, and if he were to stand in the south and receive in the north, pasuk would be disqualified. Yachol af zeke, and one might think this is true also over here by slaughtering. Tamad Lomer Oso, the pasuk says Oso b'tzafon v'lo hashochet tzarich lios omed b'tzafon. It says Oso, the animal needs to be in the north, but the one doing the slaughtering does not need to be in the north. And Rashi explains, Mekabel Omed B'tzafon, let's say the receiver of the blood stands in the north. Mefarish B'shchitas Kodshim, this is explained in Shchitas Kodshim and Beperek Ezu Makomon and Perek Ezu Makomon. Deko Amar Chatos Menolan, because we say from Chatos, where do we know the B'tzafon, Tzafon, the north is required. Techsiv V'shachatas HaChatos B'makom HaOla, it says you slaughter the Chatos in the same place as the Ola. Kabola Menolan, where do we know receiving the blood? Techsiv Basrei V'lokach HaKoy Midam HaChatos Mekabel Atzmo Menolan. And then we say, how do we know the one receiving the blood needs to be in the north? V'lokach lo yikach. So again, it says in the pasuk, and so therefore again we understand that the mekabel needs to be in the north, but that is not true when it comes to the shochet. And so instead, the Gemara continues and says, Ella rather Oso b'tzafon. When it says Oso by the Sar of the Nasi, what is that coming to exclude? That's saying Oso b'tzafon, that is slaughtered in the north. V'ein ben of b'tzafon, but the bird carbon, that is not in the north. Because Sal Kadai T'chamina, one might have thought, Lesi b'kal v'chomer mi ben son, we should make a kal v'chomer from sheep. Uma ben son shalo kavalo kohen, kavalo tzafon. If by a sheep where a kohen is not required to do the slaughtering, even a non-kohen can do the slaughtering, kavalot safon, but north is required. So benof, so by a bird carbon, shekavalo kohen, where a kohen is required to do the malika, that is the breaking of the neck, eino din shenikvalot safon, wouldn't it be logical to say that north is a requirement? And so therefore the pasuk says that there is no such requirement by the bird carbon. But the Gemara says, why would we even learn from ben son? Mala ben son shekain kavalo kli, when it comes to a ben son, so there is a kli, there's a vessel used to kill the animal, referring to the knife. When it comes to a bird carbon, it's just the fingernail of the kohen. And so therefore again we're back to the question, what is Oso coming to exclude? Ella rather Oso b'tzafon, this carbon, the soyer of the nasi, requires north, ve'ein pesach b'tzafon, and the carbon pesach, it's not required that it be slaughtered in the north of the Azara. But again, the Gemara continues and asks, Pesach, with regards to carbon Pesach, mid Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov nafka, that can be learned from the source from Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. The Tanya, as we learned in a Braisa, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, Yachol yehi Pesach ton safun, one might think carbon Pesach requires north. Vidinu, it's logical, uma'ola shelo kavalo zman b'shchitasa, if by an ola where there's no time, set time for the slaughtering, kavalot safon, there's a requirement of north. Pesach shekavalo zman l'shchitaso, Pesach, where there is a set time for the slaughtering, eino din shekavalo tzafon, isn't it logical that there should be a requirement of north? But the Braisa continues, mala ola, but what do we find by ola? Shekain kala, that it's entirely burned on the mizbeach, so you can't really learn from ola. But mechatos, but let's learn from chatos. By chatos, there's a requirement of north, again also by carbon Pesach. But malachatos shekain mechaperes al chayve krisos. But chatos is unique; it provides atonement for chayve krisos. So may Asham, so let's learn from Asham. Mala Asham shekain kachei kachim. Asham is unique; it's kachei kachim. It's a kind of carbon that's the most holy. That's not like a carbon Pesach. And mikulu nami shekain kachei kachim, and that's true by all of these examples, by Ola, by chatos, by Asham. They're all kachei kachim, and therefore you cannot learn Pesach from them. And so therefore, again, it's already clear that Korban Pesach does not require north, and so we are back to the question, what do we learn from Oso, what do we exclude? Ella rather, says the Gemara, Liolam Kitukamrin and Meikara, really it is what we said originally. Oso B'tzafon Vein HaShochit B'tzafon. We learn from Oso that the animal has to be in the north, but the one doing the slaughtering does not need to be in the north. And the Gemara continues with the Kakashalach, in that which was difficult, Midir Rabbi Achia Nafka, that we already know that from Rabbi Achia. Rabbi Achia has a different source to say that the Shochit does not need to be in the Tzafon. The Rabbi Achia Lav L'Mu'utei Shochit B'tzafon Udas. Rabbi Achia actually was not bringing that pasuk to exclude the Shochit from being in the north. That really comes from this word Oso, that is by the Sar of the Nasi. Elahachi Kamar, rather, this is what Rabbi Achia was saying. He was saying, Ein HaShochit B'tzafon, we know that the Shochit, there's no requirement of north, and again, that comes from the pasuk of Oso by the Sar of the Nasi. But Avol Mekabel B'tzafon, but the Mekabel, what Rabbi Achia is really teaching is that the Mekabel, the one receiving the blood, does need to be in the north. That's what he's learning from that pasuk. The Gemara says Mekabel, he's learning the halacha by the Mekabel. Mi lokach v'lokach nafka, isn't that learned from a different source? It could have said lokach, it says v'lokach, that's the source that the Mekabel needs to be in the north. And the Gemara says to that, lokach v'lokach lo mashmalei. To Rav Achia, he doesn't learn that drasha of lokach v'lokach, and that's why instead he learns it from the pasuk he quoted in the Brisa. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, v'chayev al lishasa v'al arichasa v'al afiyasa. One is liable for making the karban mincha chametz on the kneading of the dough and on the shaping of the dough and on the baking of the dough. For every step of the process, there is liability. And the Gemara says, Amar Papa says, off if he bakes it, lo kashtayim, he actually gets two sets of malchus. Achas al arichasa, one is on the shaping, v'achas al afiyasa, and one is on the baking. And Rashi explains, off lo kashtayim di afiyah gemara aricha. Rashi understands that baking is the completion of the process of the shaping, and so therefore baking inherently contains both, and that's why there's liability for both. But the Gemara continues and asks, but didn't you say ma'afiyah miucheda shehi ma'isa yechidi, that afiyah is its own ma'isa, its own step in the process? V'chayav and oleh b'fnei atzma, there's a liability on that alone, and that sounds like it's independent. Rashi explains, v'amrit ma'isa yechidihi v'amayim mechayeves leitarti. If afiyah, if baking is a ma'isa yechidi, it's its own step in the process, there should just be one liability, not two liabilities. And the Gemara continues and answers, lokash, it's not difficult. Had the in one case we're talking where he shapes it and bakes it, and in the other case his friend shapes it and gives it to him to bake. And Rashi explains, if he shapes it and bakes it, so then in that case we're talking about being chayev too for both of those steps. But let's say his friend shapes it and then he bakes it, then his friend is going to be chayev one for the shaping, and he actually will be liable to two, on both the baking and the shaping, the gomer, because as we said, the baking is the finishing of the shaping. In other words, in a situation where he shapes it and bakes it, so he's chayev for the shaping, he's chayev for the baking. But in a situation where his friend shapes it and he bakes it, the baking includes shaping, and he's chayev too there. Even though his friend is chayev on the shaping, hu chayev nami alo, he's also chayev on the shaping. Like we're going to say later on, even in a situation of mechametz achar mechametz, he causes it to leaven after it was already leavened, that also is included in liability. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught in a brisa, bechor she'achzu dam, a bechor, a firstborn animal which is seized by blood, essentially a life-threatening situation, makizin oso es hadam, one is allowed to let that animal's blood in order to save the animal, b'makom shein osin bo mum, in an area which is not going to cause a blemish. By a bechor, if there is a blemish on the bechor, there is an advantage in that case because it no longer is considered sacred. It can be used for the personal use of the kohen, and so therefore one is allowed to let the blood in an area that won't cause a blemish. Ve'ein makizin es hadam, but one is not allowed to let the blood b'makom she'osin bo mum, in a place where there'll be a blemish. Divrei Rabbi Meir, these are the words of Rabbi Meir. The Chachamim say yakiz af b'makom she'osin bo mum, one is allowed to let the blood even in a place that will produce produce a blemish, as long as he does not slaughter the animal on the basis of that blemish. Rabbi Shimon says, and Rashi explains, b'mokom shein osa mum, in a place where there's no blemish, hainu kol haguf, that means to say the entire body, dehadar bari, meaning to say that it's going to be healthy. B'mokom she'osa ozno ve'eno delo hadar bari, but let's say it's an area of the body, like the ear or the eye, which is not going to be able to heal properly, it's going to cause a blemish. So again, Rabbi Meir said that in such a situation, in such an area of the body, you're not allowed to let the blood. And Rashi continues, uvilvad shelo yishchor aloso hamum, the Chachamim say one is allowed to let the blood in an area that causes a blemish, as long as he doesn't slaughter on the basis of that blemish, ad sheyehebo mum me'atzmo, it has to develop a separate mum on its own. The bechor eino nechol bechutz, because the bechor cannot be eaten outside Yerushalayim, ad sheyehebo mum, until there is a blemish. And the next Rashi is on the next Amud. This is Rabbi Shimon says, af nishchat aloso mum, it can be slaughtered on the basis of that blemish. Rashi explains, Rabbi Shimon Lataymi, Rabbi Shimon follows his reasoning. Diamar davar shein miskavin mutter. Rabbi Shimon says, if you do something without intention, it's still permitted. V'zelo niskavin lahatel bo mum al menas l'shochto olav. Here the intention was not to create the blemish in order to slaughter on the basis of that mum, and that's why Rabbi Shimon is lenient. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Vav Amid Beis.